$35 billion. That's the estimated cost of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. While that seems extremely high, and it is, it wasn't even the most expensive Olympics to host, as the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the 2014 Sochi Olympics had higher estimated costs. You might think, well, those are high costs, but surely the Olympics make so much money that the benefits outweigh the costs. I thought that too, until I did more research and learned the shocking truth. There's a common belief that hosting the Olympics is a great investment for a country, both for economic and social benefits. In this video, we're going to shatter that belief. We're going to discuss why hosting the Olympics is a terrible investment, citing many examples, and there are an abundance of them, including the 1976 Olympics in Montreal, the 2004 Olympics in Athens, and the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. We'll discuss why hosting the Olympics costs so much money, as well as some potential benefits of hosting. We'll end with a discussion of some possible solutions. What, if anything, can be done to change this? And how can the Olympics become a more sustainable and responsible investment for host countries? So, what are the costs of hosting the Olympics? First, there are bidding costs. This is the amount of money that's spent on creating a bid, which is a plan that's sent to the International Olympic Committee, IOC, in order to convince them to choose their city to host. Bidding costs are extremely expensive, and they're usually between $50 to $100 million. For example, Tokyo spent around $150 million on its bid for the 2016 Olympics, and it didn't even get to host. And it spent around $75 million on its bid for the 2020 Olympics, which it did win. Next, once the city wins the right to host, it then has to build stadiums and sports facilities for the games to be played in. These can be quite costly. It's estimated that the cost of building sports infrastructure for the 2014 Sochi Olympics was around $6.7 billion. These costs can be lowered if the host city has a lot of sports stadiums already built, but most of them don't. Most of the venues needed are highly specific to the niche events that are held during the Olympics. So on top of the high construction costs, many of them go unused after the Olympics are over. Let that sink in for a second. Countries will spend millions or even billions of dollars constructing state-of-the-art sports stadiums that are used for a couple of weeks and then never again. It might be more economical to just burn the money. If you don't already think building these specialized stadiums is a huge waste of money, here's another cost that has to be accounted for: maintenance costs. These are the costs associated with preserving the usability of these stadiums after the Olympics are over. It's not good enough to just build the stadium. You also have to maintain it, or it will be in terrible condition. These maintenance costs can be astronomical as well. For example, it costs around $30 million per year to preserve Sydney's Olympic Stadium. If you think this is bad, we haven't even covered half of the costs. And neither have many of the host countries, because many of them went into debt in order to host the Olympics, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Next, there are the general infrastructure costs that include housing and transportation. Surely housing and transportation are good investments that any city needs anyways, right? Yes and no. The IOC requires that host cities have at least 40,000 hotel rooms available for tourists, and have the ability to house 15,000 athletes and others involved in running the games. In theory, building more hotels seems like a good thing, but not if they aren't needed after the Olympics are over. One example is that after the 1994 Olympics in Lillehammer, 40% of its hotels went bankrupt. It seems to make sense that the Olympics should only take place where there is already enough housing and infrastructure, but maybe I'm wrong here. Some may argue that the Olympics motivates certain countries to invest in infrastructure and spend money on things like building airports and railroads and clean water systems. That may be true, but maybe they could find other motivation for building these things, like, the welfare and prosperity of their citizens. For the 2014 Sochi Olympics, around 85% of the $50 billion budget was spent on building non-sports infrastructure. And for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, half of the $45 billion budget was spent on this. General infrastructure is usually a good investment, but a country doesn't need to host the Olympics to invest in infrastructure. They can do that anytime they want. There are also security costs involved in hosting the Olympics. For example, the security costs for the 2004 Athens Olympics were $1.5 billion, and the average security costs have ranged between $1 and $2 billion for each Olympic Games since. Let's not forget about opportunity costs. What could the city have done with that money if it didn't spend it on hosting the Olympics? Maybe they wouldn't have spent it at all, or maybe they would have found a better place to spend it that would have more sustainable long-term benefits. Lastly, there are debt costs associated with hosting the Olympics. These only occur if a country goes way over budget, but most of them do. For example, Montreal hosted the Olympics in 1976, and it didn't fully pay off its debt from this event until 2006. It's not worth it to go deep into debt to host a sporting event for a couple of weeks, no matter how much pride it may give your city or country. Alright, enough with the costs and negativity. Surely there are some benefits of hosting the Olympics, right? One benefit is the revenue. Host cities make a lot of money during the Olympics, but they don't make nearly enough to cover the enormous costs. For example, Beijing made $3.6 billion from the 2008 Olympics, but it spent over $40 billion in order to host. If somebody you worked with pitched an idea for a business opportunity where the company would make $4 billion but spend over $40 billion, they would get laughed out of the room. Revenue streams from hosting the Olympics include TV broadcast rights, international sponsors, domestic sponsors, selling tickets, licensing fees, and the influx of tourists spending money on local businesses like restaurants and hotels. TV broadcast revenue is the single largest source of income from the Olympics, but the host city doesn't get to keep all of that revenue. The host city doesn't even get to keep half of that revenue. The IOC owns the broadcast rights, and it shares less than 30% of this revenue with the host. For example, the broadcast revenue from the 2012 London Olympics was $2.6 billion, yet the host only received $713 million. That doesn't seem fair at all, but I guess there isn't much fairness in the world of money and business. Money made from international sponsors is shared between the IOC and the host city, but all of the money made from domestic sponsors, ticket sales, and licensing goes to the host. On average, these sources of income combine to be about 3 times the amount of what the host makes from TV broadcast rights, but they still pale in comparison to the enormous costs. Another potential benefit is the creation of new jobs, but most of the jobs are temporary. There is no evidence of a long-term positive impact in employment. Obviously, there is a short-term positive impact on tourism, as many people will travel to the host city in order to watch the games. However, there's no clear evidence that hosting the Olympics leads to more tourism in the long run. There's also no clear evidence that hosting has a positive long-term impact on the country's gross domestic product. It's not all bad though, as Boston's National Bureau of Economic Research has shown that hosting the Olympics has a positive effect on international trade for that country. So that's a good thing, right? Yes, but do you really need to put on this whole spectacle in order to trade more with other countries? I'm not so sure about that. The last potential benefit is not economic, but social. This has to do with pride in one's city and country. Hosting the Olympics can be a big ego boost, at least in the short term. Hosting the Olympics is like going out and having a wild night with your friends. You spend way more than you budgeted, and you have an amazing time in the moment. But then when it's all over, you wake up the next morning and think, why did I do that? And why does my head hurt so much? And where did all my money go? So, is spending and losing a ton of money in order to host the Olympics worth the temporary ego boost? For some, absolutely. For most, absolutely not. I'll have more pride in my city or country if we don't host the Olympics and instead focus on investing in things like healthcare and education and manufacturing. You know, things that help normal people live better lives. Well, there you have it. After hearing about all of the costs and benefits of hosting the Olympics, does it seem like a good investment to you? If you're like me, you say absolutely not. But since sports are a huge part of our civilization, and there's so much money at stake with TV broadcast rights, the Olympics are probably never going away. So is there a way to reform this process and make it a better investment for host cities and countries? We'll close this video by discussing 3 different solutions that have been floated, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on which is the best. The first potential solution comes from the IOC itself, and it's known as Olympic Agenda 2020. This agenda includes 40 recommendations for how to make the games a better investment for host countries. The IOC wants to reduce bidding costs, which is a good idea, as well as encourage cities to not build as many sports stadiums and use the ones they already have. According to the IOC's annual report 2020, this has resulted in profound change and progress across the entire Olympic movement, laying solid foundations for the future. And it also claims that 88% of the recommendations of Olympic Agenda 2020 have been achieved. This report claims that these recommendations helped Tokyo save over $4.5 billion when hosting the 2020 Olympics, which is definitely a huge number, but considering the event's estimated cost of $35 billion, we may need a different solution. The second potential solution comes from economists Bauman and Matheson, who argue that developing countries shouldn't host and that the IOC should award the games to rich countries that are better able to absorb more of the costs. I don't disagree with any of that. The third and final potential solution comes from the author Andrew Zimbalist, who argues that one country should be the permanent host, which will allow the reuse of sports stadiums and other infrastructure. I agree with this solution. It doesn't make sense to build new sports stadiums for a 2-week event, knowing that they'll never be used again. The issue here comes with determining which country should be made the permanent host. One potential site is Athens, Greece, which hosted the first modern Olympic Games in 1896. Another potential site is Los Angeles, California, which hosted one of the more successful Olympics, economics-wise, in 1984. These games may have actually made a profit, which is largely due to the fact that Los Angeles had a bunch of sports stadiums already built. However, some people disagree with this claim that even those Olympics were profitable. Robert Barney, director of the International Center for Olympic Studies at the University of Western Ontario, said, "There has never been an Olympic Games that has made a profit. Pulled in all the costs and revenues, including federal allotments, municipal allotments, provincial or state allotments, it's always been that a debt has to be paid somewhere. So maybe the Olympics aren't supposed to make a profit. Maybe the Olympics aren't supposed to be a good investment for a city or country. I'm not really sure what to think. I want to hear what you think."